My father looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you don't come to my wedding, we're done." Not a request. Not a plea from a man hoping his daughter would show up for the most important day of his life. A threat. Flat, cold, delivered the way you'd cancel a subscription. Like I was something he'd been meaning to get around to for a while. I remember the exact moment so clearly it almost doesn't feel like memory. It feels like something that happened to someone else, and I watched through glass. We were sitting in his kitchen, the one I grew up in, the one with the yellow backsplash my mother picked out in 1998, and that he never changed because he always said it gave the room character. The coffee between us had gone cold. His new fiance's photo was magneted to the fridge. Veronica, he called her. Veronica Hale. Beautiful woman, cream-colored everything. The kind of put together that takes real effort to make look effortless. I'd been trying to be reasonable. I really had. "Dad," I said, "I'm not asking you to uninvite anyone. I'm asking you not to seat me next to Jason Reed. That's all." He looked at me like I'd asked him to reschedule the rotation of the earth. "Jason is an important guest," he said. "He has connections in the industry. Veronica knows his people. It's not personal, Claire. It's logistics." Logistics. Jason Reed had spent 14 months of my life systematically dismantling my finances, my confidence, and my ability to trust people. He'd borrowed $11,400 across a series of what he called short-term gaps, money I'd saved working doubles at a marketing firm while he charmed his way through our social circle. When I finally confronted him with bank statements and a list of dates, he'd cried, actually cried, said he was going through something, said he'd pay it back, said I didn't understand how pressure worked. He never paid back a cent. And now he had a VIP seat at my father's wedding, and I was being asked to sit beside him as though none of it happened because he had connections. "That was your relationship," my father said. "This is my wedding." I stared at him. "You're asking me to sit next to the man who stole from me. I'm asking you to act like an adult for 4 hours." I left without finishing the coffee. I should tell you about my father, Richard Calloway, because if you're going to understand how we got here, you need to understand who he is when he's at his best, so you understand what it cost him to be this way now. He's a self-made man, genuinely. Grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Detroit, with a mother who worked hospital laundry and a father who left before Richard started school. Built a small commercial real estate consultancy from essentially nothing. Started with a secondhand suit and a gift for making people feel understood. By the time I was 10, we had the yellow backsplash kitchen and a backyard big enough to throw a real party in. By the time I was 16, he was being quoted in regional business publications. He worked hard. He loved me. He coached my soccer team 3 seasons in a row, even though he knew nothing about soccer and needed to watch YouTube tutorials before every practice. He drove 4 hours round trip when I had a panic attack my freshman year of college and couldn't bring myself to call campus counseling. He sat in the parking lot of my dorm, engine running, and just talked to me for 2 hours about nothing. TV shows, bad jokes, what kind of dog he was going to get when he retired. That was my father. The man across the kitchen table, telling me to act like an adult about the person who'd stolen from me. Because his new fiancé had logistics, that was someone else. Or maybe it was the same man, reorganized around a new gravity. Veronica had been in his life for 11 months. I'd met her twice. Both times she'd been warm in a way that felt rehearsed. The kind of warmth that hits all the right notes but doesn't quite reach the eyes. I'd told myself I was being unfair. I'd told myself I was projecting. My father was happy. He'd been alone for 6 years since my mother passed. He deserved something good. I told myself a lot of things. He called me the night after our kitchen conversation, calmer this time. Said he understood I was hurt. Said he hoped I'd reconsider. Said Veronica had suggested maybe I needed some space and time, and that the offer to come to the wedding still stood. That sentence landed wrong. Veronica had suggested. I didn't say anything about it. I just said I'd think about it. He said okay, and we hung up. I didn't sleep well that night. Lay in bed staring at the ceiling of my apartment, trying to name the feeling. It wasn't just anger about Jason. It wasn't even about the seat assignment, really. It was something older and more diffuse. It was the sensation of being quietly, efficiently managed. He showed up at my apartment 10 days later, 8:47 p.m. I know because I looked at my phone when the buzzer went off, not recognizing the street number on the intercom and assuming it was a delivery for the wrong unit. It was my father. I buzzed him up. When I opened the door, he was in an overcoat I'd never seen before. Charcoal wool, expensive buttons, the kind of coat you buy when someone encourages you to upgrade your image. His jaw was set. He'd driven 40 minutes from his house to stand in my doorway on a Tuesday night. "I need you at this wedding," he said. No hello. "Dad, I mean it, Claire. If you skip this, we're done. No dinners, no calls, nothing." He said it like a business term, like he was describing the consequence of a contract breach. "You want to throw away this family over a seating chart? That's your choice." I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd sat in a dorm parking lot for 2 hours because I'd needed him. This man who'd watched YouTube tutorials to learn offsides rules so he could coach my soccer team. "You're choosing my ex over me," I said. "I'm choosing respect." Almost laughed. Almost. Instead, I said no, quietly, the way you say something when you mean it all the way down. And I closed the door. I stood in my hallway for a while after that. Didn't cry. Just stood there listening to his footsteps retreat down the corridor and thought about the yellow backsplash and the parking lot and the dog he was going to get when he retired. Then I went and made tea and did not think about it for as long as I could. The wedding was on a Saturday in early early October. I know because it kept appearing in my peripheral vision, in my calendar, in a group chat I eventually muted, in a voicemail from my Aunt Deb telling me I was making a terrible mistake, and that Veronica seemed like a very sweet woman. I sent Aunt Deb a text that said I appreciated her concern and left it at that. I spent that Saturday at the farmer's market and then reorganized my bookshelf and then watched a documentary about competitive dog grooming. It was fine. It was completely fine. 14 days later, I walked out of a bookstore on Meridian Street. It was a Sunday, just past noon, bag of used paperbacks in hand, and heard a voice say my name, Claire. I turned. There he was, my father, arm around his new bride, grinning with the particular satisfaction of a man who believes he has won something. Veronica Hale was beside him in a cream overcoat, oversized sunglasses, hair swept back in the kind of arrangement that costs several $100s to look that casual. She was beautiful. She was poised. She was standing on a public sidewalk like she was waiting for someone to photograph her. Meet her, my father said, smug in a way he probably didn't realize he was being. My wife. I looked at her face, and something in my brain short-circuited because I knew that face. Not from the 2 times we'd met. She'd been in softer makeup then, hair different, overall presentation slightly warmer. No, I knew that face from somewhere else entirely. Somewhere I hadn't thought about in almost a year. My brain was flipping through files so fast I felt almost dizzy, and then it landed. I started laughing. Not politely. Not the little courtesy laugh you produce when something's mildly amusing. The kind that starts in your chest and escapes before you can make a decision about it. Uncontrolled, slightly wild. The kind that only happens when reality delivers something so absurd your body doesn't have a more appropriate response. My father's smile collapsed like a building losing its foundation. What's so funny? I looked at her, then back at him. I was still half laughing, pressing my fingers to my mouth, trying to collect myself. Dad, I said when I could, you really should have done a background check. Let me tell you about the Thursday night that changed everything I thought I knew. About 11 months before that sidewalk encounter, I'd been volunteering with a legal aid program downtown. The organization connected low-income residents with pro bono attorneys, and volunteers like me mostly did intake, basic paperwork, appointment scheduling, document organization, useful, unglamorous work. One evening, a supervising attorney named Margaret Cho, 15 years in civil law, the kind of woman who had 3 colored sticky note systems running simultaneously and still found yours inefficient, had pulled a small group of us into a conference room for what she called a case study session. For training purposes, she said, to help us understand the patterns that showed up in fraud cases so we could flag anything unusual during intake. She walked us through a composite file. A woman who operated under multiple names, who targeted men of a certain profile, self-made, mid to late 50s, recently widowed or divorced, accustomed to being competent and unaccustomed to being deceived. The pattern was consistent. She'd enter a social circle through a mutual connection, establish herself quickly, create emotional intimacy at a pace that felt natural but was actually accelerated, and begin the isolation process. Small comments at first. References to family members being difficult. Suggestions that certain friendships were draining him. Building a world where she was the most reliable presence. Then, once financial access was established, the exit. Margaret showed us a photograph from the composite file. It was grainy, taken from a distance, but the face was clear enough. The woman in that photograph had lighter hair, a different overall styling. She was wearing a blazer I'd never have associated with the woman on the sidewalk, but the face was the same face. The name in Margaret Cho's file had been Vanessa Hart. The woman standing next to my father, calling herself Veronica Hale, was the same person. I know how this sounds. I know the first instinct is to say, "Are you sure?" I asked myself that. I asked it hard. I stood on that sidewalk cycling through every rational objection, trick of the light, resemblance, my own bias toward disliking this woman, and I kept arriving at the same place. The bone structure under the makeup, the way she held herself, the small scar at the outer corner of her left eyebrow, barely visible but there, that had been in the photograph too. That was Vanessa Hart, and she had recovered from my laughter faster than any innocent person would have needed to. "Richard," she said, her voice sliding into something gentle and slightly wounded, "she's just bitter? This is exactly why I told you she was unstable." That sentence hit me like cold water. This is exactly why I told you she was unstable. Not, what is she talking about? Not, unstable. What do you mean? She had gone directly to a pre-planted narrative, a narrative she'd already put in place. My father's brow furrowed, not at her, not yet, but in the complicated way of a man processing 2 things at once. The Jason invitation hadn't been logistical. That was suddenly, blindingly obvious. A woman studying her target doesn't leave variables uncontrolled. She would have found out about Jason Reed the same way she found out about everything else. She would have known exactly what inviting him to the front table would do. It was provocation, engineered to produce a fight, designed to push me out before I could look too closely. I'd been maneuvered. For months. I took a breath, steadied myself. "Dad," I said, and my voice came out calmer than I expected. "Her name isn't Veronica. Start with Vanessa Hart. Vanessahart. The tiniest thing happened on her face. A microsecond. Not quite a flinch. She was too controlled for a flinch. More like a recalibration. The briefest visible pause before the next expression was ready. My father saw it. I watched him see it. "Have you ever used another name?" he asked her. Quiet. Specific. She turned on him a smile of beautiful indignation. "Richard, seriously? Seriously? She's doing this on purpose. That's not an answer. The smile didn't waver, but her hand, which had been resting on his arm, slipped away. And right there, on a Sunday sidewalk outside a bookstore, with used paperbacks in my bag and fallen leaves skittering past our feet, the perfect wedding he had chosen over his own daughter began, very quietly, to fall apart. She pressed, after that, hard. On the sidewalk, she called me vindictive. She called the moment a performance. She suggested to my father, with the particular gentleness of someone twisting a blade, that I had always had trouble accepting his happiness, and that this was simply the latest iteration of a long pattern. My father asked her to clear it up. She told him that entertaining my behavior was humiliating her. He said flat and toneless, "Then clear it up." She demanded they leave. He stood still. I watched her recalibrate twice more in the space of about 90 seconds, shifting from wounded dignity to righteous anger to something softer and more strategic, like watching a dial being adjusted. It was, in a terrible way, impressive. The performance was that good. If I hadn't known what I knew, if I hadn't seen that file photograph in a conference room 11 months ago, I might have been the one looking unreasonable. We stood there a moment longer. Then she walked toward the parking garage, heels clicking. My father watched her go. Then he looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on his face in a long time. Doubt. Not the comfortable, dismissible doubt of a man who's decided not to look. Real doubt. The kind that gets in under your ribs. "I'll be in touch," he said. He was. That same evening. I want to be honest about what the next 72 hours actually felt like, because I've seen versions of this story told as if the narrator coasted through on righteous certainty, and that wasn't my experience. That Sunday night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and a yellow legal pad and went through everything I could access about the Vanessa Hart file, which wasn't much, because it was a legal aid training document I'd seen once and hadn't photographed, and Margaret Cho's program operated on strict confidentiality protocols. I wrote down everything I could remember: the Florida connection, the name, the profile of targets, the timeline pattern. Then I second-guessed myself for approximately 2 hours. What if you're wrong? What if you destroy your father's marriage on a resemblance? What if Veronica Hale is a real person with a real identity, and you've just publicly accused her of being a fraud on a public sidewalk, and now your father is going to the home he shares with his wife, and she is going to explain, calmly, warmly, how his daughter has always done this, and he is going to believe her, and you will have torched the last bridge? My hands were shaking doing the dishes. I noticed them and made myself put the plates down and stand still for a minute. Then I called my father. He picked up on the second ring. He said he had already started making calls. He had contacted a private investigator that same afternoon, a man named David Park, who ran a small firm that specialized in background verification for high-value business transactions. My father had used him twice before in professional contexts. He'd called him from the parking garage, apparently, before he even drove home. "I need you to tell me everything you know," my father said. He sounded 10 years older, like someone had reached in and compressed him. I told him everything: the legal aid program, Margaret Cho's case study session, the photograph and the name and the pattern. I told him about the scar on her left eyebrow. I told him about the way she'd gone immediately to the pre-planted narrative on the sidewalk and why that sequence mattered. He was quiet for a while. "The Jason thing," he said finally. "Engineered," I said. "I think she found out about him and used him. She needed me away from the wedding before I could look too closely." Another silence. "I should have listened to you," he said. "I didn't say yes. I didn't say I told you so. I just said, get the documentation first, then we'll talk." David Park, 12 years in investigative services, former paralegal background, and 3 years working fraud referrals for a regional insurance consortium, delivered a preliminary report 70 hours after my father hired him. My father read it to me over the phone. His voice was entirely flat by then. The flattened voice of a man who has processed the worst of something and arrived at a place beyond shock, where everything is just facts now. Vanessa Hart. The name checked out. It was a real identity, cleanly documented going back about 2 years, which David noted was itself a potential flag, because 2 years of clean paper is sometimes what purchasing a rehabilitated identity looks like. Prior to that, the documentation became murky. A different surname attached to the same biometric data, a Vanessa Marsh, with 2 civil complaints in Georgia, 1 disputed credit account, 1 breach of contract claim that had been settled quietly. Then there was the Florida case. It was still pending at the time David pulled it. A joint bank account with a man named Gerald Foss, 61, retired property developer. $38,000 withdrawn in a 17-day window immediately before the engagement ended, and Vanessa Marsh ceased to be reachable by any contact number Gerald Foss had for her. Gerald Foss's attorney had filed the civil complaint 8 months ago. The case had stalled in preliminary proceedings, short relationships, wealthy men, accelerated intimacy, controlled isolation, financial access, abrupt exit. Margaret Cho's case study had come to life and married my father. And Jason Reed? David Park pulled on that thread too, because my father had asked him to, because that part of the story had been quietly bothering both of us since the sidewalk. Jason moved in overlapping social and professional circles with at least 3 people who could connect him, within 2 degrees, to Vanessa Hart operating as Vanessa Marsh. One of those connections was a real estate networking event in Scottsdale 14 months ago, right around the time Jason had reappeared in my father's social orbit through a mutual colleague introduction that my father had mentioned briefly, and that I now remembered like a bell being struck. Jason's VIP seat hadn't been about about his connections to my father's industry. It was about his connection to her operation. He'd been positioned as the access point, the friendly, familiar face who could get close without raising flags. The reason to invite him was the reason to exclude me. One move served both purposes. The ex who'd stolen $1,400 from me had not randomly stumbled back into my life through my father's social calendar. He'd been placed there. My father locked his accounts within 12 hours of David Park's preliminary report. He called his bank's fraud department, spoke to a manager named Teresa Okafor who specialized in financial elder abuse cases, and placed protective holds on 3 accounts and 1 investment vehicle that Veronica had had partial visibility into. Teresa Okafor walked him through what she called a contact freeze protocol and advised him to document every financial conversation he could recall having with Veronica about his assets. He went home that night with a folder of documentation and a recording app running on his phone. Veronica, I'll keep calling her that because that's the name I knew her by, though it belongs to her the way a costume belongs to its wearer, tried several things in the subsequent 48 hours. She tried the wounded wife. She tried righteous anger. She tried the loving intervention of a woman concerned about her husband's state of mind, gently suggesting to my father that the stress of Claire's accusations might be worth discussing with someone professional. She tried at one point something softer and more intimate that my father described to me only obliquely, and I didn't push him on it. None of it landed the way it would have landed 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, those approaches had a prepared surface to adhere to. Now the surface was gone. When he showed her David Park's preliminary report, not everything, just the Florida case reference, she stopped. She went very still. And then she said, "You need to think carefully about what you're doing." My father said, "I have." She left that evening, packed a bag with the particular efficiency of someone who has packed bags before under similar circumstances. No dramatic exit, no slammed door. She walked out with a rolling carry-on and didn't look back. The performance ended the moment there was nothing left for it to accomplish. That's when he knew, he told me later. That's when the last of the doubt went, because the woman he'd thought he married would have fought. She would have been devastated. She would have called his cell 17 times and shown up at a mutual friend's house in tears. But Vanessa Hart had no investment in the character of Veronica Hale beyond what that character could extract. Once extraction was no longer possible, Veronica Hale simply ceased to exist. My father filed for annulment the following week. His attorney, a woman named Patricia Voss, 22 years in family law, the kind of lawyer who sounds like she's already read every document before the meeting starts, told him the grounds were strong given the fraud elements and the documentation David Park had compiled. The Florida case against Gerald Foss was still moving through the courts. Patricia reached out to Gerald's attorney and they began building a coordinated evidentiary record. Jason Reed disappeared. Not dramatically, he didn't flee the country or send a panicked apology text. He just became unreachable, stopped answering my father's calls, stopped appearing at the industry events where he'd been a fixture. 3 months later, I heard through a mutual connection that he'd relocated to another city. I never heard from him again, which was the best possible outcome. Margaret Cho's legal aid organization was contacted through appropriate channels. She couldn't discuss case files with me, obviously, and I didn't ask her to, but she accepted the information I provided and said, in the measured way of someone very experienced at receiving information without reacting, that it would be reviewed appropriately. I don't know what became of Vanessa Hart after she walked out of my father's house with a rolling carry-on. I know the Florida case against her eventually resulted in a civil judgment. I know David Park's report was shared with law enforcement. What happened after that is in the hands of systems that move at their own pace. I stopped waiting for news about her. That's not my story to tell. My father and I had lunch, about 6 weeks after all of it. The restaurant was his suggestion, a place we used to go to on Sundays when I was in high school, the kind of neighborhood Italian spot with basket-wrapped wine bottles on the shelf and a pasta special on a chalkboard. He was there when I arrived, coffee in hand, already reading the menu, even though we both knew he was going to order the same thing he always ordered. He looked older, not devastated. My father isn't a man who performs devastation, but older. Like something had been added to him that weighed a specific amount. He didn't apologize in a speech. My father isn't a speech man. He said when I sat down, "I should have seen it." I said, "She was very good at what she did. That's not an excuse for what I said to you." "No, it's not." We sat with that for a moment. The waiter came and we ordered the same things we always ordered, and the afternoon light came in through the window at an angle that reminded me of something I couldn't quite name. "She'd been working on me," he said. "I can see it now. Every conversation we had about you, she was always the one who brought it up. Always. I thought she was being thoughtful, trying to help me navigate a difficult relationship with my daughter." He shook his head. "I handed her the controls and called it love. You were lonely," I said, "and she was trained for lonely." He nodded once. "You closed the door on me," he said, "when I came to your apartment." "Yes." "Good," he said. "Just that. Good." We ate lunch. We talked about other things. The dog he was still going to get when he retired. A golden retriever, he thought, or maybe a lab. A project he was consulting on. A book I'd bought at the store where this whole thing had unraveled and then never managed to start because life had gotten complicated. It wasn't a healed thing, that lunch. I want to be honest about that too. There were things said that don't unsay themselves, and a version of my father I'd seen across a kitchen table that I couldn't fully unlearn. Trust doesn't reconstruct itself the way it broke. It rebuilds differently, with visible seams. But we were both there, and we both stayed. That mattered. 3 months later, I ran into Aunt Deb at a family birthday party. She'd left me approximately 11 voicemails during the whole saga and had been reliably, lovingly wrong at every juncture. She pulled me aside near the appetizer table and held my face in her hands the way she'd done since I was small. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Aunt Deb, she seemed so sweet." "They always do," I said. She thought about this. "How did you know?" "I thought about a Thursday night legal aid training session, about a grainy photograph in a conference room, about the kind of knowledge that sits dormant in your brain until the exact moment it's needed, like a fire door you hope you never have to use." "I paid attention," I said. "A long time before any of this happened, I paid attention when it didn't seem important. That's all." Aunt Deb nodded like this was wisdom. "It is, a little. It's also just luck. Paying attention at the right time, in the right room, 11 months before you need what you learn there, that's not strategy. That's chance. I was lucky, but I showed up for my own luck. I didn't talk myself out of what I saw on that sidewalk. I didn't choose comfortable doubt over difficult certainty. I didn't close my eyes because keeping them open was going to cost something. That part I earned."